For many decades, I read tarot without reading books about tarot. I had one tarot book. It was The Tarot by Alfred Douglas, which, looking back on it, wasn't a particularly good book. But, since the dreaded pandemic, we've all been at home a bit. And one thing I did was I read, and I started to read more about tarot. It's a big field, isn't it? It's a really wide field. And when you dive into the books on the tarot shelf in the bookshop, it's a bit daunting because they tend to disagree with each other and they come from all different sort of angles, don't they? Anyway, long story short, today, and what I want to say is that in a sense, even though this isn't the jolliest book, it's not the lightest book, it's not the funniest book, it's not the best written book, it's not the most pro-divination tarot book there is, but we do want to get our facts straight as far as we can. There's still disagreement about tarot. There's still disagreement about the facts. It's not a very well documented part of human history or human culture. But it's good to have a writer who really does sit down and sets out to give us the facts. Now, the good news is that this book is quite short. It's even shorter than it looks, ladies and gentlemen, because look, you think it's that long, but actually all that is footnotes. So the book itself is a mere 176 pages. It's a bit dry. It is dry, it's academic, and there are a few pages towards the beginning where you think to yourself, what am I doing reading this? I'm never going to last out. But persist, please persist, because it's good. And what it does is it really gives you, in a sense, everything that is known and established as fact about the history of tarot. It gives you that in 176 pages. And that's good news. Now, there are other books on the market that rabbit on about tarot. There's the dreaded Decker and Dummett's, History of the Occult Tarot, which is 350 pages long, and which is not only dry and academic, but it's also kind of hostile, isn't it? And that's a really difficult book to read. And oddly enough, Helen Farley, bless her, who is not really coming from a New Age angle. She's not really a tarot supporter in that way. She's too academic for that. But she refers to Decker and Dummett's work because it is important research work. But she points out that they are not impartial as academic people should be. She points out that their tone really is, what's the word? It's very personal, and something that I noticed when I was reading that book is that they just express their distaste for esoteric tarot rather more than they should. That's an aside. Let's get back to this book. It's precise, it's factual, and although Helen Farley is obviously a very cultured, very highly read and brilliant person, the book, I think, on a communication level, I don't think it's fantastically well written. I don't think the language of the book is fantastically clear at all points. And part of that may be because I'm probably intelligent enough to read it, but I might not be as widely read as I could be. Sometimes the writing is so concentrated that she will fly in someone. She'll say Swedenborg, was an influence, and she'll fly in this important cultural figure, and you're kind of meant to know everything about that reference. And then she will just move on, and she hasn't explained why she has pulled in this reference. So in a sense, it's very concentrated, but it's good. And in these 176 pages, you really do get a fantastic overview of tarot. You get the early days in Milan, in the Renaissance. You get the middle period. You get the occult revival in the 18th century. You get the Golden Dawn, and you get a nice section about the New Age. What I found really eye-opening, actually, was her work that she does about the absolute origins of tarot. She talks about how things were in early 15th century Italy. This is really interesting. She says that it wasn't a nice time to live in. She says it was a very pessimistic, very desperate time. And people think of the Renaissance, people think of, beautiful objects and beautiful paintings. But actually it was a dark time. Here's what she says about Renaissance Italy. Far from the modern perception of the Renaissance as a time of art and beauty, this was an exceedingly pessimistic period characterized by a morbid preoccupation with death. The enduring strain of economic depression, the unremitting proximity of death, and the difficulties inherent in maintaining even a modest existence began to erode religious faith. The church was riddled by internal strife as factions battled for power, wealth, and territory, resulting in the Western schism, which saw two popes battling for the loyalty of a divided Europe. This perceived fallibility of God's representatives exposed them as ambitious political contestants rather than spiritual leaders, and this realization manifested in society as an increasing secularization. So, when people like Kat Willett, who did that comic strip book about Pamela Coleman Smith, when she just assumes that the church was this huge, powerful, patriarchal thing that ruled everyone's lives when tarot was being invented. Not true. The church was going through a bad patch. And, the inclusion of the Pope and the female Pope in the tarot pack was really an anti-church gesture. The tarot pack was probably invented for a guy called the Duke of Milan, who was horrible, who just ruled over his citizens like some vampire. And he kept thousands of hunting dogs because he liked hunting. And he forced the citizens of Milan to look after these dogs and feed them. So they were having difficulty feeding themselves, but they had to feed his dogs. I mean, it was that sort of time. It was really nasty. But the Duke of Milan, when he had probably had the tarot invented for him by his servants or his advisors, he was a religious man and he believed in God and he wanted to go to heaven when he wasn't being, a bit of a fascist. But he didn't agree with the Pope. He didn't agree with the church at all. He thought that was a bad thing. So in other words, the tarot, in a weird way, even though it might have, Christian symbolism in it, you can't take it at face value. And I have always thought that the tarot seems to be subversive, and indeed in its way it is. Plus, the Duke of Milan and his family were related to a woman who had basically set herself up as a kind of female pope, and I think had been horribly executed by the actual pope, Sister Manfredi she was called. And this woman had quite a cult about her. And these people were going to war with each other. Dukes were going to war with dukes, dukes were going to war with emperors, and dukes were kind of going to war with popes in those days. It was dramatic stuff, it was bloody stuff, and it was kind of chaotic, very culturally interesting, but it wasn't this this modern naive view of history as this Orwellian nightmare in which there was this ruling system which just was totally in control and just was torturing the poor. I mean, the poor were tortured by a variety of different people, but it wasn't 1984, was it? Helen Farley doesn't think that the tarot was esoteric at its roots. Fine, she's not really an esoteric person. She's a fact hound, isn't she? She says that there is no evidence for any esoteric content in tarot or any form of cartomancy before the 18th century. People do disagree with her about that. Paul Hewson disagrees with her. And actually, Ronald Decker kind of disagrees with her. So I think you have to take it with a pinch of salt. But I think she's probably right that the absolute invention of tarot was not an esoteric project. She's very against the idea that tarot has its roots in ancient Egypt. She says, oh, there's no connection with ancient Egypt. Well, yes and no. If you read Ron Decker, there is a kind of connection with ancient Egypt because the people in the Renaissance, even though they didn't understand the hieroglyphs, they liked them. And they were into Egyptology. So it's not that the Egyptology idea was imposed on tarot in the 18th century and in the Napoleonic period. Not really. There is evidence that, back in the 15th century, they also loved ancient Egypt. They thought it was stylish and exciting and mysterious. And they wanted tarot to have some of the atmosphere of ancient Egypt, even though they didn't know what that culture really meant. So there is a connection. So you can argue with some of her conclusions. She doesn't know everything. She refers to the Waite-Smith deck as the Waite-Coleman deck, which is, it's a tiny mistake from someone so learned. But I suppose what I'm saying is that she's dealing with so many thousands of facts and she's piecing them together in the best way she can, that it's not all going to be necessarily absolutely gospel truth. Tarot isn't very well documented. There isn't conclusive evidence for all of the things we want to know about. So we just have to do the best we can. I liked the atmosphere of this book, even though I found it quite difficult to read at times. As she gets into the New Age period, you realise that in a way she's quite in favour of, the New Age approach to tarot. She's quite in favour of personal development and positive thinking and doing your best and maybe trying to expand your mind. She's a bit cautious about it because, in academia, you tend to have to be cautious about these things, or at least you probably did until about 5 years ago. The book came out in 2009, and I think it's still probably fairly state of the art. I recommend it. I think it is absolutely essential reading, and also I think it really helps if you are talking to really hardcore skeptics or hardcore academics, or if you have the misfortune to read anything by Decker and Dummett. It's good to have this up your sleeve as a kind of a rock-solid, fact-based fallback. Oh, one last thing. Helen Farley thinks that there probably was a Prudence card in the original tarot, and she thinks, considering how chaotic the early days of tarot were, and considering the fact that the major arcana, well, first of all, they weren't numbered, and secondly, there was no consistent major arcana for the first, 100 years or so. She thinks it's highly likely that the original decks did have a Prudence card and it was just simply lost. And ever since then, people have been, thinking, oh, the Hanged Man is the Prudence card, or the Hermit is the Prudence card in disguise. I don't think so. And the idea that there have to be 21 or 22 major arcana cards, that's really a Kabbalistic concept that's been imposed on tarot in later years. I think we could just revive the Prudence card. I think we could have 23 major arcana cards if we wanted. But it occurred to me the other day that actually it's not such a bad thing that the Prudence card sort of fell through somebody's floorboards, is it? Because of the virtues, Prudence is probably the least interesting one, and certainly not the one which we as modern people are most concerned with. That was my review of this welcome addition to one's bookshelf, A Cultural History of Tarot by the lovely Helen Farley. I'm Robert Farrer, this is Tea and Tarot, and I think I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm usually back in 1 week, but in certain months of the year, I take little breaks to recover my strength. Bye.